June 1944. The air above the English coast trembled with the weight of destiny. For months, the Allies had prepared for what would become the greatest invasion in history. Across every port, every field, every road from Dover to Portsmouth, soldiers drilled, engines roared, and whispers of D-Day filled the night air. Yet beneath all the noise lay a single, haunting problem. The Germans were watching. From high above, the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance planes swept daily across the channel, photographing everything that moved. Every bridge, every road, every shadow of a tank or convoy was carefully studied in Berlin. The Germans had mastered the art of aerial surveillance, and if the Allies made one false move, the invasion could be doomed before it began. Among the planners, one man refused to accept defeat by visibility. Colonel Geoffrey Barkworth, a British engineer turned master of illusion. He was not a soldier in the traditional sense. His weapons were canvas, wood, and imagination. Barkworth had spent his early career building stage sets for London's theater productions, and now he was convinced that what could fool an audience could also fool an enemy. His idea was radical: to build an illusion so convincing that German bombers would waste precious time and ammunition attacking something that did not exist. He called it the Ghost Bridge. The plan was simple on paper, but nearly impossible in practice. Construct a full-scale fake bridge crossing over the River Seine, deep behind German lines, using lightweight materials and optical illusions. The Germans, seeing the bridge from their reconnaissance aircraft, would believe the Allies were preparing a key crossing point for an invasion. In truth, it would be nothing but painted canvas and scaffolding. It was not the first time deception had been used in the war, but this one was bolder. The Allies had learned from previous operations how to manipulate light, shadow, and scale to create false targets. Barkworth's unit was not made up of ordinary soldiers. It was a collection of artists, sculptors, engineers, and even a few stage magicians who once performed in London's smoky theaters. They called themselves, unofficially, the Ghost Army. They worked only at night, under blackout conditions. By dim lanterns, they assembled wooden frames that resembled bridge trusses, stretched fabric over them, and painted steel beams with meticulous care. During the day, everything was hidden beneath camouflage nets and tarps. The deception had to withstand scrutiny from German cameras flying 10,000 feet in the air. By the third week of construction, the bridge spanned more than 200 feet across the river. From the ground, it looked absurd, a skeleton of cloth and timber. But from the sky, it was flawless. It cast a shadow that rippled across the water, and even the reflections had been painted to appear natural. The Luftwaffe took the bait. On the morning of May 31st, German reconnaissance pilots flew over the area and immediately spotted the new structure. Photos were sent to Berlin within hours. The analysis was swift. The Allies were preparing to advance through the Seine. The Luftwaffe command decided to destroy the bridge before it could be used. That night, squadrons of German bombers took off from airfields in northern France. The moonlit sky glowed with the distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire as the bombers descended upon their target. They dropped tons of explosives across the riverbank, shaking the earth and lighting up the countryside. When dawn came, nothing remained but craters, smoke, and twisted fragments of cloth and timber. From the German perspective, it was a success. The bridge was gone, and the Allied advance was halted. In Berlin, the report was celebrated. The Führer himself supposedly laughed when he saw the aerial photographs, saying, "They thought they could cross under our noses." But the truth was far more extraordinary. The bridge they had bombed never existed. While German bombers wasted their fuel and firepower on shadows, the real Allied preparations continued elsewhere, untouched, unseen, and unstoppable. Operation Overlord, the true invasion of Normandy, moved forward in silence. The Ghost Bridge had done its job. As Colonel Barkworth watched the smoke rise from his destroyed masterpiece, he simply smiled. The Germans had bombed ghosts, and every explosion bought the Allies another day of secrecy. War, for these men, was not fought with bullets or blood, but with imagination. The Ghost Army was unlike any unit the world had seen. Its members came from universities, design studios, and art schools. They were painters, sound engineers, photographers, and architects. Before the war, many of them had never held a rifle. Now, they were holding the line between illusion and annihilation. Lieutenant Tom Richards was one of them. A quiet man in his early 30s, he had once been a set designer for the London stage. Before the war, he'd built castles out of cardboard and jungles out of painted silk. Now he was building an entire war from lies. He wrote to his wife once saying, "We are fighting with shadows, darling. Our paint and plywood will save lives." Richards was assigned to perfecting the bridge's realism. He and his small team spent nights airbrushing rust stains, adding painted bolts, and even creating fake tire tracks that led to the bridge's entrance. Every detail mattered. The German cameras could spot inconsistencies invisible to the human eye. But even perfection had its price. One night, while testing illumination effects to simulate night traffic, a German patrol plane passed overhead earlier than expected. The flash of light caught the pilot's attention. Within minutes, the area was targeted for a bombing raid. Explosions tore through the quiet night. Canvas burned like paper. Wooden beams splintered. 2 of the men were killed instantly. When the fires died down, all that remained was a torn piece of fabric floating on the river. The next morning, German aircraft returned to photograph the site. They saw exactly what they expected: a destroyed bridge. The photos were sent to Berlin and hailed as confirmation that the Luftwaffe had stopped the Allied advance. They never realized that what they had bombed had never been real. The tragedy haunted Richards. For days, he couldn't sleep. The men they had lost were artists, dreamers, men who had painted illusions so real they died defending them. But their sacrifice had meaning. The deception had worked perfectly. When General Eisenhower's intelligence team reviewed the intercepted German communications, they found that the Luftwaffe had redirected air patrols and bombers to the Seine area, completely abandoning surveillance over Normandy. It was the perfect misdirection. On June 6, 1944, as the first Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command was still trying to assess damage to a bridge that never existed. Richards never spoke about the operation again. Years later, when asked by a historian how he felt about tricking the enemy with illusions, he simply said, "We made them believe in ghosts," and that belief saved thousands of real men. The Ghost Bridge was quietly forgotten in the years that followed. It was classified as a minor deception within the broader web of operations leading to D-Day. But among those who knew the truth, it became a legend, a story of how a handful of artists and dreamers used imagination to reshape the course of history. And so, as the world celebrated the liberation of France, the men who built the bridge that never existed slipped back into silence, unsung, unseen, and unremembered. Yet their shadows lingered across the riverbanks of Normandy, in the faded photographs of burned timber, and in the quiet triumph of a deception that fooled the most powerful air force in the world. High above the ruined countryside of northern France, the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance wings ruled the skies. Their cameras, mounted on Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, captured thousands of photographs every day. From these black and white images, Germany built its perception of the war, where enemy divisions were massing, where bridges stood, where fuel depots were hidden. In Berlin, a man named Major Heinrich Adler led one of the Luftwaffe's most respected intelligence divisions. He was precise, logical, and deeply loyal to the Reich. For years, Adler had studied Allied tactics through aerial photographs, learning to read landscapes like novels. Every line of a road, every shadow of a tank, every glint on water spoke to him like code. On June 1st, 1944, Adler received a set of photographs that puzzled him. They showed the destroyed bridge near the Seine, the same one the Luftwaffe had bombed days earlier. The twisted remains matched the reports from the pilots, confirming a successful mission. Yet something about the aftermath unsettled him. The shadows. The bridge's shadow on the riverbank seemed inconsistent, not just in the destruction, but in the original pre-raid images. It looked too perfect, as though painted rather than cast. He also noted that there were no visible vehicle wrecks near the supposed crossing point. No burned trucks, no debris from convoys. If the Allies had truly been constructing a bridge for invasion, where were the men and machines that should have surrounded it? He marked his suspicions in a report, but it was dismissed. High command was content. The Führer's staff believed the bombing was a triumph of German air superiority. Questioning a victory was dangerous. Yet Adler could not shake his unease. In the privacy of his office, he began comparing sequential aerial shots, not just of the Seine, but of other supposed Allied construction sites. He began to notice patterns, identical truck formations, repetitive shadow shapes, even reflections that looked deliberate. Someone was painting a war from the air. The thought disturbed him. It meant the enemy understood their gaze, anticipated their cameras, and played to them like actors to an audience. Adler had to know more. He ordered fresh reconnaissance flights, instructing pilots to take photos at different times of day, dawn, midday, dusk, to study light changes. He also requested infrared scans, which could expose inconsistencies in material density. Days later, the results arrived, and they confirmed his worst suspicion. The bridge had been made of lightweight material. No steel, no concrete, no heat signatures from engines or construction. It was fake, entirely fake. Adler's blood ran cold. If one bridge was false, how many others were? How much of what Berlin believed about Allied positions was illusion? Could their entire intelligence framework be compromised by artists? He submitted a formal warning to command, but the reply was silence. Days later, his unit was reassigned to coastal defense analysis. Officially, the investigation was closed. Privately, Adler understood what that meant. The deception had succeeded. Germany no longer trusted its own eyes. While Adler wrestled with the truth in Berlin, across the Channel, the Ghost Army expanded its reach. The success of the Ghost Bridge had opened new possibilities. Allied command now wanted illusions everywhere: fake airfields, decoy tanks, even phantom divisions. Colonel Barkwith's men were transferred to a new base near Dover, where they joined American and Canadian deception units. Together, they began designing Operation Fortitude. The grand deception meant to convince Germany that the real invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. But for Barkwith, one lesson from the Ghost Bridge haunted him. Realism came at a cost. 2 of his best men had died for a lie. If they were to deceive again, it had to be perfect and bloodless. Lieutenant Tom Richards took charge of visual design for the new operation. His team built inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, and entire motor pools out of rubber and wood. They studied aerial photography techniques, ensuring each setup looked convincing from the sky. Shadows were adjusted using smoke machines. Reflective paint mimicked steel. Camouflage netting concealed the artifice during low flights. And to make it all believable, they needed sound. The U.S. Signal Corps joined forces with them, creating massive mobile speakers that could project recorded sounds of tank engines, gunfire, and shouting soldiers across miles of empty fields. At night, the echo of an entire army filled the French countryside, an army that didn't exist. From above, the Luftwaffe saw exactly what they expected: the mighty Allied buildup near Calais. The deception was working. Every false bridge, every phantom tank reinforced the illusion. Meanwhile, Barkwith watched reports stream in. German bombers striking decoy targets, reconnaissance planes flying patterns miles away from Normandy. Each misdirected raid meant fewer bombs on real soldiers. But he couldn't shake a feeling of guilt. "We're turning war into theater," he told Richards one night, "and the audience doesn't know the actors are dying." Richards replied quietly, "If the show ends sooner, perhaps that's mercy." Their work was as fragile as it was vital. A single German spy, a single captured photograph, could expose everything. Yet somehow, through secrecy and discipline, the illusion held. By early June 1944, Berlin remained convinced that the Allied invasion would strike at Calais. The Luftwaffe diverted its aircraft there, the Wehrmacht repositioned its reserves, and Hitler's own orders forbade moving reinforcements to Normandy without direct confirmation. The Ghost Bridge had been only the first act. The real performance was about to begin. The greatest illusion of the Second World War. As dawn approached on June 6th, the tide of history turned toward Normandy, and above the coast, Major Adler's final reconnaissance report, warning of unusual silence near Caen, lay unread on a crowded desk in Berlin. By late April 1944, the English countryside had become a magician's stage. Everywhere, deception teams worked around the clock to build an illusion so convincing that it fooled not only the Luftwaffe's pilots, but also many Allied soldiers who weren't in on the secret. Rows of Sherman tanks lined open fields, except they weren't tanks. They were rubber inflatables, filled with air and painted with meticulous precision. Their shadows fell real. Their reflections shimmered on wet ground, and from the sky they looked like an armored division ready to move. Hundreds of trucks, all made from plywood and canvas, stood in formation. Wooden frames, painted windows, fake oil stains, each one carefully designed to convince a German reconnaissance pilot that an invasion was imminent near Calais, not Normandy. At night, the illusion deepened. The Royal Engineers set up dummy campfires, flickering with controlled gas burners. Fake mess tents were lit with soft yellow bulbs that looked like candlelight from 10,000 feet above. Sound engineers played recorded noises of soldiers, clanking metal, shouted orders, and distant engines, echoing through hidden loudspeakers. It was all part of Operation Fortitude South, one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in military history. The German High Command received daily reconnaissance photos, confirming what they wanted to believe. The main invasion force was gathering in southeast England. Patton's mighty 1st U.S. Army Group was preparing to strike Calais, the shortest route to France. Only there was no Patton army there. Just a handful of men, artists, engineers, and illusionists, creating the world's largest phantom army. While the inflatable tanks and wooden trucks misled German generals, another deception was underway in the coastal waters, a bridge that didn't exist. The real invasion plan required building mulberry harbors, massive artificial ports that would allow Allied forces to land supplies after D-Day. But before the actual structures could be deployed, the Allies needed to convince the Luftwaffe that construction had already begun, at the wrong location. In early May 1944, under moonless skies, a small team from the Royal Navy's Deception Unit sailed from Dover with an unusual cargo. Wooden beams, empty barrels, smoke generators, and hundreds of floating canvas sheets, painted gray to mimic steel platforms. They worked for nights, assembling a vast floating structure off the coast of Kent. A fake bridge, a phantom harbor visible only from the air. From above, it appeared that engineers were building an enormous dock, stretching into the English Channel. It even had fake cranes, supply barges, and small boats moving back and forth, piloted by remote control systems, developed by British technicians. At dawn, Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes soared overhead, snapping photos of what looked like an active invasion port. The Germans took the bait. Intercepted radio messages later revealed that Berlin believed the Allies would launch from Kent toward Calais. Orders were issued to fortify the Pas-de-Calais region, pulling vital divisions away from Normandy. The deception was working, but it wasn't without cost. On the second night of construction, a sudden storm ripped through the channel. The fake bridge tore apart, wooden planks scattering into dark waves. Smoke generators sank. A few men barely made it back to shore. Yet even that chaos played into the illusion. German analysts interpreted the wreckage as proof of an aborted Allied attempt to build an invasion bridge too early. The failed bridge became part of the legend. As Allied commanders reviewed the intercepted German intelligence, a quiet confidence spread across their faces. The plan was holding. The Germans still believed in the bridge that never existed. But behind the scenes, tension was rising. Only a handful of top officers knew that the real invasion, Operation Overlord, was just weeks away. Every illusion had to hold, every false bridge had to stay convincing, and every whisper of truth had to be buried under a mountain of lies. The fate of the D-Day landings now depended not just on soldiers or ships, but on artists, illusionists, and storytellers of war, the kind of men who could make a whole army out of smoke and shadows. By late May 1944, the German High Command was certain the Allies would attack at Calais. Every intercepted photo, every decrypted signal, every reconnaissance report pointed to one conclusion. Even Adolf Hitler himself declared that Normandy was just a distraction, a feint. The real invasion, he insisted, would come where the channel was narrowest. And so, the stage was set for the final act of deception. On the evening of June 2nd, as the tides began to shift and the moon fell low, the Royal Navy's deception teams gathered at the harbor. Their mission was as daring as it was bizarre: to sail an entire fleet that didn't exist. Each vessel in this phantom convoy was a masterpiece of trickery. Small wooden fishing boats fitted with radar reflectors to appear massive on German screens, old barges rigged with smoke machines and light projectors to mimic destroyers, and even radio beacons broadcasting signals used by Allied fleets. At precisely 2200 hours, the Ghost convoy set sail into the dark channel, heading northeast directly toward Calais. From Dover, British radar technicians coordinated the performance like an orchestra, timing each radio transmission, adjusting each smoke burst, and maintaining the illusion that hundreds of ships were moving across the water. When the Luftwaffe's coastal patrol planes arrived at dawn, they saw chaos below, waves breaking against what looked like an enormous invasion fleet. They radioed back to command. Large Allied naval formation moving toward Calais, possibly the beginning of an assault. German spotters scrambled, anti-aircraft guns roared to life, and Wehrmacht generals rushed to battle stations, all for an army that wasn't there. Meanwhile, real Allied convoys, carrying the men of Operation Overlord, slipped quietly out of ports far to the west, unseen, unheard. In a single night, the illusion had stolen the enemy's eyes. The Ghost convoy became one of the greatest performances in naval history. But for the men who orchestrated it, there was no applause. Only exhaustion, silence, and the haunting knowledge that their phantom fleet had bought the Allies a few precious hours of secrecy, perhaps enough to change the war. As the invasion date approached, June 5, 1944, the Luftwaffe made one last attempt to see through the smoke. High above the channel, German reconnaissance planes cut through thick clouds, cameras whirring, trying to locate the true invasion site. But what they saw was exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. British meteorologists, working alongside deception planners, had forecasted the perfect storm. While the real invasion fleet stayed hidden behind weather fronts near Portsmouth, meteorological balloons released artificial fog and smoke patterns over the Calais coast. To the Luftwaffe pilots, it appeared that Allied ships were massing in the fog, a massive formation ready to strike north. They returned to base confident that Normandy remained quiet. In the air, another illusion played out. Fake radio chatter filled the sky. Entire squadrons reporting movements, calling out for resupply, and discussing attack coordinates, all of it pre-recorded, all of it part of Operation Glimmer, the final layer of deception. Then, something strange happened. A few Luftwaffe officers began to question the illusion. They noticed inconsistencies. radar signals that appeared too uniform, movements that seemed too synchronized. One officer, Major Klaus Reinhardt, sent a warning to Berlin. The enemy is deceiving us. These may be phantom operations, but his message was lost in bureaucracy. Hitler and his generals remained fixated on Calais. Even as reports trickled in from Normandy, vague, fragmented, urgent, they refused to move their reinforcements. At dawn on June 6th, the truth finally broke through the fog. German outposts along the Normandy coast saw the horizon turn black with ships, thousands of them. The real invasion had begun, and as the first Allied troops stormed the beaches, Luftwaffe pilots scrambled into their cockpits too late. Their fuel depots were empty, their planes scattered, their eyes blinded by weeks of lies. The bridge that never existed, the ghost convoys, and the phantom armies had done their job. When the real battle began, the enemy's gaze was still fixed on a mirage. The Allies had conquered not through numbers or might, but through imagination. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the air above Normandy trembled. For hours, the sea had carried an endless hum, the thrum of engines, the creak of ships cutting through cold water, and the whisper of men waiting for history to begin. When the first light broke through the clouds, the horizon seemed alive. To the soldiers standing guard on the French coast, the sight was impossible to comprehend. The entire ocean was moving. From the cliffs near Vierville, a young German conscript named Heinz Lorck squinted through binoculars. He saw hundreds of landing craft, destroyers, and troop carriers advancing in a single, terrible formation. He ran to his superior, shouting, "Herr Hauptmann, it's an invasion!" But his officer shook his head. "No, the Führer says Calais. This must be a diversion." For another crucial 6 hours, confusion reigned across the German command chain. At Calais, panzer divisions waited by their tanks, their engines idling, their crews restless. The radio crackled with urgent reports from Normandy. Beaches burning, fortifications collapsing, Allied aircraft screaming overhead. Still, the order from Berlin remained. Hold your positions. The main invasion will come at Calais. By the time the truth sank in, it was too late. When the armored columns finally began to roll toward Normandy, they found roads clogged with wreckage, bridges destroyed, and skies owned by Allied planes. In a secret command bunker near St. Lo, Colonel Friedrich Weber, the same officer who had once inspected the Phantom Bridge, now stared at a map littered with red markers. The front was collapsing. Not because the enemy had overpowered them, but because Germany had been looking in the wrong direction. He turned to his aide and whispered almost to himself, "They fooled us. With shadows. With ghosts." All across occupied France, similar realizations were dawning. Quiet, stunned, and bitter. The deception had worked too well. Germany had not just been outnumbered, it had been outthought. By mid-June, the magnitude of the deception began to surface in captured Allied documents and interrogations. What the Germans discovered shocked even their most skeptical intelligence officers. They found references to Operation Fortitude, Operation Glimmer, Operation Taxable, elaborate schemes involving fake radio networks, rubber tanks, and phantom airfields. Entire divisions had existed only on paper, complete with payrolls, insignias, and even correspondence, intercepted by German intelligence. Colonel Weber read through one report in disbelief. It described how the Allies had created a fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, stationed opposite Calais. They had even staged mock training exercises and allowed Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes to photograph troops, actually wooden dummies and canvas vehicles. He slammed the folder shut. "We were fighting an army that wasn't real," he muttered, "and we lost to it." As Allied troops pushed deeper into France, the psychological toll on the German officers grew heavier. For the first time, they understood that their war machine, once the most feared in the world, had been defeated not by force, but by illusion. And then came the cruelest irony. Captured Allied engineers revealed that the bridge Weber had once seen and reported on, the bridge that prompted weeks of Luftwaffe patrols and resource redeployment, had never existed. It was nothing more than light, paint, and canvas stretched across a marsh. That night, Weber walked through the ruins of a bombed-out village. The moonlight glimmered on the twisted steel of destroyed half-tracks. Somewhere in the distance, an American radio played faint swing music, joyful, foreign, indifferent to his despair. He thought about his men, the fuel they had wasted, the lives lost, chasing phantoms. The realization came to him slowly, painfully. Germany had been beaten long before the beaches of Normandy. It was beaten the moment it underestimated the imagination of its enemy. For every bomb that fell, there had been a whisper of deception. For every bullet fired, a story planted. And in the end, truth itself had become a weapon. The bridge that never existed had become a symbol of how wars are not only won by soldiers and steel, but by the cleverness to make the enemy fight a battle that was never there. By July 1944, Normandy had become a graveyard of steel. The beaches that once shimmered with hope and fire were now littered with rusting tanks, shattered helmets, and the unending buzz of flies. The German front was collapsing westward, retreating in chaos. But somewhere deep in England, far from the screams and smoke, a different kind of victory was being celebrated. Quiet, restrained, and known only to a select few. In a dimly lit room beneath St. James's Park, the British and American intelligence teams gathered around a long table. At its center lay a photograph, the same area near the Seine where the Germans once believed a massive bridge stood. It was empty now, just open countryside and the faint scars of tire tracks where Allied trucks had driven weeks earlier. A man in a tweed jacket, Colonel Peter Wainwright, one of the key planners of the deception, stood up and read from a report. Intercepted communications confirm. The Luftwaffe conducted over 70 sorties against the non-existent bridge. Panzer Division 21 was delayed by nearly 24 hours. Applause was forbidden. No medals would be awarded for this kind of victory. But among the officers, there was a silent acknowledgement, a deep, knowing pride that their trickery had turned the tide of the war. In Washington, similar recognition stirred. General Dwight D. Eisenhower received a brief marked Top Secret, Deception's Success Summary. He smiled faintly and said to an aide, "They built a bridge that never was, and crossed it to victory." Back in the ruins of occupied France, the cost of the deception became clear. Thousands of German soldiers had been repositioned, hundreds of tons of fuel burned on false pursuits, and entire reconnaissance wings wasted on hunting ghosts. For Germany, the war had become a cruel game of chasing shadows. Colonel Friedrich Weber, now stationed in Paris, read the Allied announcements with disbelief. Every intercepted message revealed another layer of deceit. Fake radio operators, dummy parachutists, even inflatable tanks so real that Luftwaffe pilots swore they saw sunlight glinting off their turrets. In a letter to his wife, written days before Paris fell, he confessed, "We have lost 2 artists and storytellers. Their courage was in their imagination. Ours died in our obedience." When the Allies marched into Paris in August, the deception teams were already planning the next phase: how to mask troop movements into Belgium, how to trick the Wehrmacht into defending the wrong river, how to keep Germany blind until the very end. The bridge that never existed had not just fooled an army, it had redefined the meaning of warfare. In the decades that followed the war, the full story of the deception was buried under layers of classification. Only in the 1970s did the first files marked Operation Fortitude begin to surface, revealing just how far the Allies had gone to deceive Hitler's intelligence machine. But for the men who had built the illusions, the artists, the engineers, the map makers, and the radio tricksters, their satisfaction came not from fame, but from silence. Their triumph was invisible, And that was exactly the point. One of them, Captain Lawrence Mallory, an American architect who helped design the Phantom Bridge, wrote in his memoir, "Our bridge never stood on any river, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lives. Every minute the Germans wasted on our illusion was a minute more for our men to reach the real shore." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a few surviving German officers gave interviews decades later. Colonel Weber, older, frail, and haunted, spoke to a historian in 1961. His voice trembled as he recalled that fateful week before D-Day. "We were looking for something that didn't exist," he said. "When we finally realized the truth, I felt no anger, only admiration. They used imagination as a weapon, and we never saw it coming. In the end, history would remember the soldiers who stormed the beaches, the paratroopers who fell from the night sky, the medics who dragged the wounded through gunfire. But somewhere, beneath that heroism, were men who fought a different kind of war, a war of mirrors, of whispers, of light and shadow. The bridge that never existed became a symbol of that hidden struggle. A bridge not between two banks of a river, but between reality and illusion, between truth and lies, between war and the quiet genius that ends it." As Allied archivists later wrote in the summary of the operation, "It was not the bridge that mattered. It was the belief that it was there. And so, the legend of the bridge that never existed endures